Systematic doping is hugely prevalent among Russia in international sporting, most recently resulting in 47 Olympic medals being stripped from their competitors, the most of any nation with over 200 Russian competitors caught doping in the Olympic Games. Following a series of doping tests being confirmed positive for Russian athletes during the 2016 Games, 111 athletes were disqualified from competing. And following a lengthy investigation, it was found that the Russian government had been involved in a state-sponsored doping scandal. Subsequently, Russia was banned from participating in the Olympic Games among other sporting events until 2022 and faced fines totaling $1.5 billion for their actions. Despite the International Olympic Committee, the IOC, making doping illegal in the 1960s, pharmaceutical advancements have thrived. As we'll come on to later, the World Anti-Doping Agency, WADA, alongside the IOC, have said they will impose more stringent measures to catch doping in athletes, particularly for what was meant to be the 2020 Tokyo Games, through greater levels of testing and sanctioning if caught doping.
Game theory can help to understand why Russian athletes dope and help to determine governance tools to stop it. To begin with, we will depict the decision made by any athlete to dope. To do this, we assume a game between two athletes with equal ability, both of whom are rational with equal payoffs. We further assume a binary choice between doping and no doping, with no distinction in the quality of doping supplements, such that the athletes are of equal ability again if they both dope. The decision is also made simultaneously. The game is represented as shown with payoffs of 4 for winning accounting for the satisfaction and monetary benefits, a payoff of 0 for losing and split payoffs for draws. These payoffs initially assume that there is no chance of being caught and thus no sanctions for it.
Whilst this might look similar to a prisoner's dilemma, it is not, as each player has a dominant strategy to dope, resulting in dope being the dominant strategy Nash equilibrium with all outcomes being Pareto optimal. A better comparison faced by Russia in previous Olympic Games can be built by using additional assumptions to represent a prisoner's dilemma game between a Russian athlete and a non-Russian athlete, who experience information asymmetry between themselves. In addition to the previous assumptions, we assume that doping can only be identified after athletes compete, as was the case in the majority of Russian athletes in previous Olympics. We also assume that a payoff of -1 is given if athletes are caught doping, accounting for the reputational impact and negligible fines that Russian athletes faced in 2016. Taking note of the struggles that the IOC and WADA stated in identifying doping, we will assume a modest probability of being caught doping at 0.5, aligning with Ulrich et al.'s report where WADA admitted to the lack of resources to keep up with the pharmaceutical advances, limiting their positive testing of doping in the IAAF World Championships in 2011 to only 1.4%, whilst 44% of athletes admitted to doping. A final assumption will be a payoff of 2 awarded to athletes losing to athletes caught doping, as whilst they will win the event, they will miss out on the immediate podium celebrations. Factoring these assumptions, we can build a simple form matrix as shown. Analysing this game, again, a dominant Nash equilibrium of both playing doping can be found as neither player can benefit from a unilateral change of strategy. However, this Nash equilibrium is not Pareto efficient, and therefore there is an opportunity for Russian and non-Russian athletes to cooperate and agree not to dope, to achieve the Pareto optimal outcome. However, as we assume players are rational, given the one-shot nature of this game, there is beneficial deviation from cooperating. The sub-Pareto optimal outcome can also be explained by Schelling's model built in micro-motives and macro-behaviors, as doping is the best action of the athlete when acting in their own self-interest. However, it leads to other athletes undertaking a similar action as they find themselves in the minority, the aggregate impact of which is not desired nor anticipated by the other athletes. Whilst doping here is considered to be the Nash equilibrium outcome due to its payoffs that it generates, it may also be used as more of a tool to gain an advantage. Considering the limelight effect of winning, doping can be seen as a form of compensation, which one athlete may use as a device to compensate for the perceived less favourable position as they believe that the other athlete has superior resources such as training and coaches. This may be the rationale for Russia as a nation, as they lack some of the coaching resources that the likes of the US, China and the UK have. If the games were finitely repeated, players would also prefer to deviate from cooperating in the Nash equilibrium. Considering that doping in Russia's case was state-sponsored, we can study the game in an infinitely repeated case. Although not possible with Olympic Games, given that they run every 4 years, we can build the assumption that whilst athletes will not participate infinitely, Russia will get athletes to play for the honour of their nation, such that if cooperation of not doping is agreed between competing nations in one generation, they will pass it on to future generations. To build this, we can study the discount factor needed for such cooperation and deviation from it. First, considering the payoffs previously stated, we can observe the decision to dope through a grim trigger strategy. Building on the analysis shown, if either the Russian or non-Russian athlete was to signal to the other that they plan to use a grim trigger strategy, the athletes will cooperate in a non-doping Nash equilibrium being Pareto optimal as long as both athletes' discount factors are greater than 0.75, being indifferent if equal to 0.75. Secondly, if a less harsh threat strategy for deviation from cooperation was used, we can observe the decision made on doping through a tit-for-tat strategy as shown, where Russian athletes will only cooperate if their discount factor is greater than 1.5, which is not possible, and non-Russian athletes will only cooperate if their discount factor is less than 0.66. Thus, in a tit-for-tat strategy, we can see that Russian athletes will never cooperate for non-doping outcomes, regardless of the conditions for cooperation from a non-Russian athlete. Therefore, both nations will never cooperate in a no-doping outcome, and thus always enter an outcome of doping that is sub-Pareto optimal. Given that we have established the conditions among which Russia's current doping practices can be explained, we will now suggest how doping can be mitigated in the future and analyze if the IOC's options to increase sanctions and testing for what is meant to be the 2020 Summer Olympics will be effective, in relation to Becker's theory on crime and punishment. Assuming that the IOC and WADA become perfect in testing such that the probability of being caught rises to 1, we can determine the cost associated with doping to deter its use by manipulating the previously defined payoffs in one-shot games. To study the relationship between the cost of being caught and the strategies available to Russian and non-Russian athletes, we can consider the shown simple form game, with C being the cost of being caught. Allowing Q to be the probability that non-Russian athletes dope, and 1 minus Q being the probability that non-Russian athletes do not dope, comparing expected utilities with the probability of being caught doping at 1, we can see that Russian athletes prefer to dope when the cost of being caught doping is less than 2. However, if we make the pessimistic assumption that the IOC and WADA will not be able to increase the catching of doping in athletes, keeping the probability of being caught at 0.5, the calculations can be adjusted to suggest that Russian athletes will only dope if the cost of doping is 4 or below. Using this analysis and statements by the IOC and WADA, we can make the assumption that the probability of being caught will rise to 0.9 as they promise to perfect their testing, with sanctions rising to -5 accounting for the greater fines and bans that the IOC suggests. As shown, building on the previous two-player game, this will result in a situation where both players have not doping as a dominant strategy, with not dope being the dominant Nash equilibrium, with no motivation to cooperate away from it, as it is also the Pareto optimal strategy. To touch on some of the limitations of our analysis, we have considered only two-player games for simplicity. However, in reality, choices are made when considering a wide range of athletes involved in games, yet the choices of doping and not doping remain the same. We've also assumed that all testing results in positive results, however false positives are possible. We've also not considered the impact of players communicating with each other in real life, and as such there is an opportunity for players to communicate their strategies for doping or not doping, which would also require the consideration of cheap talk and credibility. We have also assumed that all athletes are of equal ability with or without doping, which we know is not true as non-doping athletes still display different abilities, and dope varies in quality and quantity when used, thus impacting the ability of athletes further. Finally, we have not extended the game to consider the impact of both governing bodies and customers on decisions made by athletes, also accounting for the opportunity for corruption and additional stringency. Building on this in our briefing document, we show the impact of the governing body signaling to athletes in the Bayesian perfect equilibrium outcomes.